So the Gauteng provincial government is scrambling to provide clarity on COVID-19 infrastructure projects planned for the coronavirus wave that's now passed. The provincial government paid about 365 million rand to construction companies in August and September in order to build field hospitals using alternative building technology. But so far, the buildings and ICU units are still under construction, even though no tenders or scopes for the hospitals have been seen. It's also still unclear if due processes were in fact followed in the awarding of health infrastructure tenders. Mark Heywood is Maverick Citizen Editor, and he says the sums simply don't add up. He joins us now via our video link from Johannesburg. Mark, thanks very much for your time. Welcome to the AM Report. Can the Gauteng government afford yet another scandal? We've already seen the PPE saga unfold in spectacular ways. It appears that there may be things untoward insofar as the infrastructure is concerned.
Good morning, Ayanda. I think that the Gauteng government can't afford another scandal, but I'm afraid that there may be another scandal in the offing, because it's quite possible that corruption or mismanagement around the infrastructure program could be on a scale as big as the PPE corruption, or possibly even larger. The problem is, and this is one of the criticisms that we are making as we investigate this issue, is that so much at the moment remains clouded and so much remains hidden. But I think the very fact that things are being hidden forces you to question, is there a reason for trying to hide some of the real costs and some of the real decisions about the processes that were undertaken in deciding to build these hospitals and then in their construction?
And so as that probe continues, help us take stock of what we know so far. I mean, for the fact that there are still buildings and ICU units that are still under construction, that certainly leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah, well, what we know so far is that back in March or April, the Gauteng provincial government, we don't know quite who, and that's important, decided to build 1,400 extra ICU beds at 4 hospitals. That's George Makari, Christani Baragwanath, Kopanong and Jubilee Hospital. ICU beds, I stress. And they decided to use something called alternative building technology, because the advantage of alternative building technology was that it allowed rapid construction in order to meet the COVID-19 wave. Now, as we sit talking today, you and me and Ayanda, none of these hospitals are finished. But the first wave of COVID-19 peaked about 6 weeks ago. These hospitals will only come on stream sometime between now and the end of November. There are also questions about how these hospitals are going to be equipped, how they're going to be staffed, and so on and so on. So on the one hand, you want to commend the Gauteng government for being proactive. On the other hand, you have to say, is this a question of just very, very poor planning and wasteful expenditure, or is it something more concerning? As you mentioned in your introduction, so far 365 million has been dispersed, has been paid to 4 companies that are building them. The budget is 1.2 billion, so there's still a lot of money that has to be paid. And one of the criticisms that people in the building industry are making, and it's a very valid criticism, is that the actual costs are not being disclosed. So if you look at the latest Gauteng expenditure disclosure report, which was published last week, is all you see is 300 or 400 million for this hospital, 300 million for this hospital. There's no breakdown as to what those costs actually are or where they're coming from. So perhaps, and this is the best case scenario, Premier Makura or the MEC for Infrastructure Development will come on and say, this is all just a scare. Here's the tender, here's the figures, here's the reasoning. It would be best if that was the case. But at the moment, I feel as if they are keeping silent on many of these questions. The MEC, Tasneem Mortara, was on your show, I believe, last week. I quoted her in my article. She said that proper procurement processes were followed. Well, I haven't been able to find evidence that proper procurement processes were followed, and neither have people working in the construction industry. So, she could put all the documents on the table this morning and perhaps this issue would go away, but the ball is in her court.
Absolutely. And of course, we're watching with keen interest because it certainly feels like there is an appetite for that kind of accountability to finally take place. But I imagine there's also been direct, call it, interactions that you might have tried to have with the Gauteng government. I imagine, too, that they will want to have a right of reply after our exchange. What has been some of the hurdles that you've had when trying to reach out to them for these specific things to account for, so for lack of a better term?
Well, no, look, I have to say that the Gauteng government, or the spokespersons for the MEC for Health, acting MEC, and MEC for Department for Infrastructure Development have been very helpful up until a couple of days ago, answering my questions very quickly, providing me with documents. But the answers that were given, of course, just for me, seem to confirm that there may be a problem here. So government has been very helpful. But what appears to be happening now is that the health department is pushing all responsibility onto the Department for Infrastructure Development. They're saying, this is not us, this is not our problem. Ask the questions of them. Ayanda, I sent a list of, I think, 18 very pertinent questions to the spokesperson of Infrastructure Development, MEC, yesterday. I haven't had an acknowledgement. But I think if those questions were answered and those documents were supplied, and the public has a right, remember this 500 million, 365 million, ultimately 1.2 billion is taxpayers' money. There's a public interest, there's a public responsibility. Answer those questions, and I think we will know one way or another whether this is, whether there may be corruption involved in here or whether everything is above board. I'm still prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt.
As we do that, you've already outlined the best case scenario. This might have been just poor planning and perhaps they haven't had the best communicators working in their offices. Still, if we do find that that is the case, we might have buildings that are still under construction post, if you like, the first peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. I wonder if there's anything to make of that, because surely that's also in the public interest. How you are spending the money is one aspect of the conversation, and whether or not you are spending it as effectively as you should is another closely related, but certainly another aspect of the conversation too.
Well, you're absolutely right. My sources tell me that these 1,400 beds, because of the way in which they've been constructed, will not be needed for COVID-19 because the peak has passed, and that the technology makes it very difficult to repurpose them for other uses. One of my sources is a doctor at George Macquarie Hospital, in fact the chief intensivist, we make no bones, Dr. Nyathi Mdladla. He points out how his ICU in the hospital is still in a state of disrepair. It has lots of problems with it. But 400 meters away, they're building this new construction with 300 new beds. But there's a big field that separates it from the main hospital. How do you get patients from the field ICU hospital into the main hospital? He points out that he engaged multiple times with Gauteng government, asking them to amend the proposed construction plans to make it useful for doctors working in that hospital, and that none of those changes were ever made. So again, perhaps when you give Gauteng the right to reply, you specifically ask them, will these hospitals be repurposed? At what cost will they be repurposed, given that we've spent 1.2 billion rand building them? And how will they be staffed, and with what equipment? Because the 1.2 billion rand is just the cost of erecting these hospitals. It is not the cost of staffing them. It is not the cost of putting in intensive care, sophisticated medical technologies. It's a fraction of the cost. So as you can hear from what I'm saying, questions, all of which ought to have answers.
Absolutely. And I guess, let me put it on record, we're more than willing for the Gauteng government to come onto the AM report to give some answers to not only your questions, but certainly a few others that have emerged from me as we had this discussion. Let me thank you for your time and for sharing some of the work you've been doing with us. That is, of course, Mark Heywood. He is the editor at Maverick Citizen. Mark, thanks very much indeed.